Murphy, and I am a senior research scientist here at the Global Women's Institute. And I am one of the people working on the Putting Survivors at the Center project that we're going to be talking about today. I'm really pleased to be joined by some of our amazing colleagues on the project. First off, we have Gabriela Nassif, who will be speaking later about the project. She's a senior research associate with GWI and instrumental in coordinating the project. We also have Katie Allen East from Women for Women. She is the senior project manager in charge of coordinating the project from the field side from Women for Women. She'll be talking more about their role later. And then finally, we have Anastasia Olembo, who is the associate director for gender equality and social power for Women for Women, and is a key technical member of the team in making sure that the projects that we're trying to design work for women and girls throughout Women for Women's programming. So we're really happy to have you join us today. This will be about a 1-hour session, and it's really for us to give you a little bit of information about our new and exciting project, Putting Survivors at the Center, which is focused on designing new programming models to support non-GBV focused organizations to better support GBV survivors. And just to say, we couldn't do this work without our partners at USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, who are the prime donors for this initiative. Next slide. Just very briefly about the project before we get into more details. The Putting Survivors at the Center project, it really aims to develop new programming models that build the capacity of non-GBV specialist organizations to receive disclosures from GBV survivors. And when we say non-GBV organizations, we're really talking about organizations that don't provide specialist response services. So they might do gender-based violence prevention, they might do gender equality or women's empowerment work, or they might not do any of that. But what they definitely do not do is provide response services, as this program is really focusing on strengthening the response side of the package when we think about GBV service provision in emergencies. And we are working on designing programs that can work for a multitude of organizations, including organizations like our prime partner, Women for Women, who have core programming that is focused on supporting women and girls, as well as organizations that have very limited gender expertise. For example, perhaps just do nutrition programs or food aid, but don't necessarily have a gendered component as one of their core aspects of programming. So throughout our programming, we're trying to look at kind of both sides of the spectrum. Next slide. So why is this project? Why does it exist? Why are we trying to do this? Ultimately, one of the things that Women for Women in particular came to us with was this challenge that they were experiencing, and that when we did our formative research, found that a lot of NGOs are experiencing, that if you aren't necessarily a GBV specialist organization engaged in case management or key on the referral pathway, there's a gap in understanding what the best practices are for these types of organizations when they receive disclosures during routine programming. We obviously have the GBV Pocket Guide as kind of a core basis that, is very helpful and has been very helpful as part of this process. But it is very, very, very basic, and it is really meant for places where there are not necessarily gender-based violence services. So this program is really trying to aim to build on that and to fill the gap where the guidelines and resources don't exist to actually build the capacity of frontline staff to both support survivors in the moment and where these organizations can work to actually support the provision of gender-based violence routine care by, for example, partnering with and strengthening specialist work. So the project goals are really to respond in a safe and appropriate manner, meet survivors' basics and immediate needs, and facilitate access between GBV survivors and response services. as I said, we're not trying to occupy or exist in a vacuum. We're really trying to build on and lift up those existing guidelines that are available, like the GBV Pocket Guide. But we're also trying to make it more robust, to build more guidance, to try out new approaches, and to learn from them. And this is really this project was designed in response to the needs and demands of non-GBV organizations and what they were really experiencing in the field when they were having cases of violence disclosed to them as part of their routine work. Next slide. So just to say, as I mentioned on the title page, GWI certainly could not do this project alone. It is very much a collaboration. And the three that I'm going to highlight here are, of course, USAID BHA, which is both a donor as well as a collaborator on this project. The Global Women's Institute at George Washington University, that's us. We're leading this initiative, but we're working in lockstep with Women for Women International, who are coordinating the project from the field perspective and working to make sure that the pilots are rolled out in our 3 target countries. Next slide. So I'm going to pass it on to Katie, who's going to talk a little bit more about Women for Women and their role.
Great. Thank you, Maureen, for the introductions as well. So for anyone who's not already heard of or familiar with Women for Women International, we're a global NGO that's been investing in the power of women survivors of war for over 30 years now. So I'll just briefly talk about our core programming so that you can it kind of then will make sense a bit more when we talk about the rest of the project and how this research is tying in. So we particularly focus on working with women in post-conflict or conflict-affected countries, and we engage women in a year-long program, typically, that combines knowledge, sharing information with practical skills and support. So as part of that program, women cover a whole range of topics. They learn about the value of women's work and opportunities for that, health and wellness, rights and decision-making. They learn about safety nets, networks, and connections, how to make connections to other women. And then there's a very practical component around numeracy skills, business management, and they can choose a vocational skill to learn. They're also supported to form savings and lending groups. And they're given a monthly stipend, and that's to help them practice their saving, invest in a small business, or really to use however else they want. We don't kind of set specific parameters around that. So the women come together in groups of 25, and they have one core trainer, a Women for Women staff member who's with them for that whole year for covering quite a lot of those topics. And then they also have some other specific trainers for specific skills sessions. And then alongside that direct support, which on that diagram is all the kind of area in green, we also work to create change at the kind of household and community level. So we do that through our men's engagement program, which is now a 6-month comprehensive training program for men that covers a whole range of overlapping and similar topics to those we cover with women. And we also do quite a lot around advocacy. We have a change agents training program for graduates, graduate women from our year-long program. They can do additional leadership and advocacy skills training, and then we support them to take action in their community on issues that really matter to them. So due to the context, and this is just relating back to what Maureen said, given the context that we work in and the experiences that women we work with have been through, and then the fact that some of our training talks about gender-based violence and it talks about women's rights, also the fact that women build these long-term relationships of trust with our trainers, that they're with, every week or couple of weeks over a year. This does mean that we really frequently receive disclosures of just gender-based violence. But in the past, our staff have struggled a bit with knowing how exactly to respond and really, I suppose, where the boundaries of their role lie, what they should or shouldn't do, and where they might be going too far even because they want to support the women. So this is what led us to wanting to collaborate with GWI on this project and why it's so relevant for us. And then I'll just briefly mention, if we go on to the next slide, that we work in a range of countries globally, but the ones that we are focusing on for this project are the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and Iraq, which are ones where this issue is very much relevant, and we found that that's kind of quite a blend of different contexts where we can get a whole range of different experiences. We can pilot some quite different activities that hopefully will also then be applicable to other wider contexts afterwards. So we can then, rather than just hearing from me, I think on the next slide, you can hear some brief introductions from some of my colleagues. Over to Gabriella.
Yeah, so we'll start with our colleagues in the DRC, and then we'll move back to our colleagues from Kurdistan and South Sudan.
Bonjour à tous. Moi, je suis Marie-Marthe Boulambo. Je travaille au sein de Women for Women comme responsable ou manager d'autonomisation sociale. Et nous travaillons en RDC. Nous avons débuté notre projet Placer les survivantes au centre avec Global Women Institute et le projet appuyé par PSAC depuis septembre 2022. Bon.
Sorry, and I will go back to our PowerPoint here. Okay. Okay, so is everybody seeing the PowerPoint again, the presentation? Great. So we'll go on, and now we'll meet our colleagues from Kurdistan.
My name is Ajin. I'm PSS officers, putting survivor at the center project.
So this is Abbas Badal. I'm the Monitoring Evaluation Research and Learning Officer for the BHA project, which is survivor at the center.
And then our colleagues from South Sudan.
My name is Martina, the project coordinator putting survivors at the center project, implemented by Women for Women International in collaboration with the Global Women's Institute at George Washington University. My name is
Great. So now that you've met,
My name is Ajin. I'm PSS officers, putting survivor.
My name is.
Now that you've met some of our team members, we also wanted to share that alongside working with Women for Women teams in each of these countries, Women for Women has also started working with other local partners. So among these include Mercy Corps in Kurdistan and Iraq, with Rio, the Réseau d'Innovation Organisationnelle in DRC, and then in South Sudan, the Agency for Research and Development Initiative, which we call RD for short. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to start by walking you all through basically the overarching kind of way that the project is organized. What are the steps we've taken to develop some of the activities that we're currently now implementing, and then what are we hoping for in terms of outcomes at the end of the project. So the project is organized according to 3 different phases. Our very first phase was the formative research phase. So during this phase, it was really our primary goal to identify key barriers and challenges to accessing GBV specialized care in all 3 country contexts, and as well to identify contextual pressures and needs, because of course, as Katie mentioned, all 3 of these sites are very, very different, and that's actually allowing us to kind of maximize our learning opportunities in this project. Phase 2, which is the phase we're currently in, started with the development of these pilot program models to support survivors. And throughout this process, what we're doing, of course, as well as refining the pilots, is also kind of looking forward towards phase 3, which will include developing a lot of guidance documents and case studies from the pilot activities about what worked well, what maybe didn't work well, and what we think might be replicable or might be scalable in different contexts. So during phase 1, which was the formative research phase, research was conducted in all 3 countries and was supported by a much larger literature review about gender-based violence specialized service access in different conflict settings around the world. So of course, this means our data sources were varied and included design workshops, which I will explain a bit more in detail in a second here. We also held TAG consultations, both at the global level and at the local level. And eventually we did hold a much larger TAG meeting, which included a mixture of both global experts and local experts. We also organized and ran some primary research. This was primarily through focus group discussions with women and girls, and then key informant interviews with community leaders and other really key stakeholders in each of the country contexts. And then, as I mentioned, our secondary research was primarily a really rigorous and huge literature review, which you can find on our website, and we'll put the link in the chat box during the Q&A session so you can take a look. But we use that secondary literature to sort of validate our findings and to make sure and kind of compare and contrast what we were seeing in terms of barriers and challenges to accessing these specialized services in emergency contexts. So for the design workshops that I mentioned, the design workshops use what's called a participatory action research approach to really engage local stakeholders in a 3-day workshop. So in each of the 3 contexts, so in Kurdistan, in the DRC, and in South Sudan, we held a 3-day design workshop. And of course, here the ultimate goal was to get people discussing the existing barriers and challenges to seeking specialized GBV services, as well as towards the end of those 3 days to really build consensus around a set of priorities that would hopefully ultimately help to lower and remove these barriers. And we organized the workshops as follows. So day 1, we invited GBV specialists to participate. Day 2 was a day solely for non-GBV participants non-GBV specialists to participate, excuse me. And then on day 3, what we did is we brought representatives from both groups to participate, again, as I mentioned, in these consensus building activities. Because of course, you know, when you get all these different people in the same room, you come up with a list of maybe 100, 200 different recommendations. So the idea of day 3 was really to kind of drill down and figure out, okay, what are some of the most important recommendations to lower these barriers to survivors, and what should we be doing sort of in the immediate term? And here on this next slide, you can see these are pictures of some of our participatory activities that we did doing these design workshops. So these are both ways of ranking priorities and really doing that consensus building kind of work. So at the top, and this one is in French, you can see that the recommendations, which are all in the pink Post-it notes, have been ranked from less important, which is on the left, moins important, to plus important, which is on the right. And the same thing in the bottom right-hand corner, this is in English, you can see that on the Post-it notes in orange, they have been ranked along a spectrum, along that black arrow in the background, from least important to more important. And again, this was not participants saying that there's anything that should be ignored, but just us working together to really identify what are things that if we take immediate action can really sort of help survivors get to these specialized services. So alongside the design workshops, excuse me, we also did additional primary research with women and girls. This was really our kind of key focus. Again, to get firsthand experience about what are the things that are preventing survivors from accessing specialized services. So we use primarily focus group discussions here, and we employ 2 data collection tools, hypothetical stories and community mapping. And again, these are really participatory in the way that they're organized. The hypothetical stories uses, as the title implies, a hypothetical story to get participants to really talk about this hypothetical person and why she might have not decided to get or to access specialized services. And then the second tool was our community mapping tool, which asks participants to visually map out, quite literally to draw out their communities and the spaces or people within their communities where they might seek services. And at the same time, what places or people they would really prefer to sort of avoid in that time when they're seeking specialized services. And here you can see just a really an image of a community mapping exercise sample. This was done in Kurdistan. And you can see the buildings in red are highlighted because these are the ones where a survivor might seek services. And alongside interviewing women and girls, we also wanted to get the opinions and inputs of community leaders and various stakeholders. And this group was very broad because, again, each of the settings was very, very different. But generally, we included community leaders, especially religious leaders, healthcare providers, or other staff at organizations that had been receiving survivors and offering some type of GBV service. As Katie mentioned earlier, we also spoke with community leaders known as change agents who had actually gone through some of the programming at Women for Women, or that Women for Women offers, excuse me, and who had, become leaders within their community and had been, receiving some disclosures. Similarly, we interviewed male community advocates, again, people who had gone through some type of training already through Women for Women. And then finally, we interviewed and spoke with GBV working group and cluster members. And we really tried to include both when it existed and when it was feasible, the groups at local and the national level. So the key findings, while I wish I could go through each one by one, we don't have the time for that. So we've organized them here according to thematic area. But again, the full report is published online and you can actually go through and see each of the specific findings. But what we saw across all 3 sites, and this was largely supported by the global data as well, is that there were a few key areas of challenges or barriers preventing survivors from accessing specialized services. One of the big ones was financial barriers. This included anything from actually paying for the service. So this was especially true for healthcare services, and also extended to paying for things like transportation, right? So if the service was not available in the survivor's own community, were they able to kind of amass the funds to actually, take a taxi or pay a driver to take them to the specialized, the location of the specialized service? Prohibitive context. This is kind of broad, but includes things like a lack of childcare, right? Women survivors who had responsibilities at home or weren't able to leave home because of certain restrictions. This also included the location of services. Again, some people were aware that services existed, but they were just too far away and it was just inaccessible to them. At the bottom in yellow, of course, a big one, which should hopefully come as no surprise to anybody, is the stigma that's associated with accessing certain services or certain service providers. And this was really a key issue in smaller communities. One of the examples that we like to kind of tell over and over again that came up in our research is within this one community, it was so small that everybody kind of knew or associated this one healthcare building with a person being crazy. So irrespective of what the person was seeking, what type of service they were looking for at this organization, if you were seen even remotely close to this building, you were assumed to be crazy. So all of these kind of stigmas affected survivors' kind of willingness to go out and seek or access specialized services. And then finally, a key issue was actually a lack of capacity among service providers. And this was really in relation to things like maintaining confidentiality, offering kind of the full gamut of services that a survivor should have access to, and just generally having a more gender equitable attitude towards survivors. So all of these things really affected survivors' willingness to seek specialized services. Key recommendations then that came out of this research for, again, how to kind of lower and ultimately remove some of these barriers or challenges to seeking high quality services. And again, these are organized kind of thematically. First, really building the capacity of GBV specialized providers. And similarly, building the capacity of non-providers, right? That very first person that a survivor comes into contact with, if they're situated at an organization like a local NGO or a religious leader, how does that person respond? And are they then able to kind of facilitate the survivor's entrance into the referral pathway? Raising awareness about existing GBV services. There was a lot a lot of times we found that really there was a lack of knowledge about the types of services that existed and where to find these services. Gender equitable trainings, as I mentioned earlier, there is really a need to kind of increase awareness about what it means to use a survivor-centered approach and to maintain, gender equity when doing this work, and especially when working with survivors. And then lastly, to facilitate access to services. And again, more recommendations to improve GBV service provision and support. And these are also, so whereas the first set of recommendations really came from women and girls themselves, these are coming from not just community leaders, but also staff from organizations that are providing these specialized services. So they similarly recognize that they are interested in and in need of more capacity building. There was a larger desire to empower community level advocates and resources. I think what was really interesting, and this came out of South Sudan, is the desire of actually religious leaders to be empowered and to participate in trainings that help them respond to gender-based violence. Responding to accessibility issues. This is really, again, it's a wide range of things, but it extends from providing access to survivors with disabilities, as well as providing access to survivors who, might not be able to pay for services or might be too far away from these services. Again, more awareness raising about accessing these services where they're located. There was also a really big desire to build multi-layered support systems. And what we saw come up again and again was a desire to kind of link some type of socioeconomic empowerment programming alongside GBV specialized services, right? This desire to not leave the survivor kind of out on her own and alone, once she seeks a service. Increasing women and girls safe spaces. And then finally, almost everybody, spoke about there's definitely a need to kind of strengthen the legal framework that exists in each of these places to combat gender-based violence. Okay, so that was all phase one. Once we kind of collated all of these findings and sat together as a group, again, we sat with our Women for Women colleagues at the global level, at each of the country levels. We really worked to develop a set of options for programming. And this is what we called, our menu of options. And this was just a sample list of potential pilot activities that responded to the findings of our research. And what we did was, after a few iterations of this menu going back and forth, we kind of identified three main thematic areas where we wanted programming, where we wanted pilot programming to kind of respond and work around. And these were the improved immediate handling of disclosures. So really strengthening folks like frontline staff at these humanitarian organizations to know what to do when somebody spontaneously discloses to them an incident or an experience of violence. Connecting to and supporting existing specialized services. And really, this just means we wanted to strengthen organizational capacity to facilitate survivors' entrance into the referral pathway. And then finally, thinking about some medium and long-term support, again, really in response to that desire to have programming that doesn't just respond to the survivor, for a few days and then backs off and is like, okay, you're on your own. So really thinking about longer term support and what that can do in these various contexts. So from that list of three thematic areas, what we did is we drilled down again. This was a very long and iterative process, but we drilled down again and sort of identified some key programmatic areas that we wanted the pilots to kind of respond to. So in the top left, and these are supposed to be color coded. I know it's a bit difficult to follow from the previous slide, but so in the dark blue, the improved immediate handling of disclosures, our pilot activity is around really building capacity to provide psychosocial first aid and immediate support for survivors. Then on the right-hand side, in that kind of teal color, thinking about connecting to and supporting existing specialist services. Here we have things like strengthening survivor-centered care and gender equitable attitudes among GBV service providers, strengthening coordination between non-specialists and specialists, and then strengthening referrals to specialized services. So again, all of these activities under this thematic area are really focused on how can we as non-GBV specialists really facilitate the survivors' entrance into the referral pathway? Like, how can we help them get to the right organizations and the right services? And then finally, in the yellow box, under medium and long-term support, thinking about the provision of psychosocial support and the provision of community-based psychosocial support. So I won't go through all of these. You can see them on our website, and we'll talk about them a bit just briefly towards the end of the presentation in our Q&A. But it's important to say that because all of the contexts, again, are so different, not every context is implementing the same set of pilot activities. We really tried to work with each of the teams to identify which types of activities they felt would best respond to the needs of women and girls and survivors in their contexts. So you can see just by looking at it, right, some countries there are more pilot activities than others. Some don't necessarily have activities from one thematic area or another. But again, this is done purposefully to really respond to the contextual needs of each of the areas that we're working in. Okay. So as the activities have begun, we've actually started to receive some initial feedback from our partners. So really what's been done across all three settings, and which is one of the few pilot programs that's being done in all three, is a training to really support frontline staff on how to better respond to a spontaneous disclosure, right? How do you administer psychosocial first aid in a way that's appropriate? And how, again, do you support a survivor who decides that they want to receive specialized services? And as well, how do you support a survivor who decides, no, I don't want to go to any specialized services, I'm just disclosing. So those trainings have already started in all three sites. And here we're just getting some feedback from our colleagues in South Sudan, who we saw at the beginning of the presentation, about why these trainings are actually so important.
Of GBV incident are undisclosed because of lack of skills and knowledge for non-GBV specialist organizations who are working with the community. They have no training of how to receive disclosures. So to us, this project came timely because it is going to equip non-GBV specialist organizations who are working within the community but are unable to receive disclosure from GBV survivors, and also not able to refer them to service centers with best practice and also local realities. So to us, this project has come when we need it most, and it is going to change the face and the situation which the survivors of GBV have been going through.
And similarly, we also had some feedback on this first pilot activity to kind of train up frontline staff to better respond to disclosures from our colleagues in KRI, in Kurdistan, and as well.
Handling disclosures trainings, the most important part is working on the referral pathway and updating the service map. And in the same times, like providing psychological first aid for the women participants by the Women for Women trainers staffs. So this is the most important parts as a non-GBV staffs, non-GBV organizations, not trained, non-specialized. They will receiving disclosures from GBV survivors and link and listen, link and refer them to service providers that they provide GBV. So this is the most important, like enhancing the referral pathways and service providers, and provide psychological first aid as an non-GBV organizations or actors.
And so here, just to add a few notes, so Ajin, as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, is working with the Kurdistan team. And really what we saw here from this training is that there was actually a huge gap in knowledge and awareness about the referral pathway in terms of which organizations are still working, which are still actively receiving survivors. And this was because in Kurdistan, we have a very kind of specific context, and in Iraq more generally, which is this transition away from humanitarian funding to more development funding. So one of the key findings that came out of this context in particular is that a training like this is needed and was needed as these kind of larger funding transitions are happening, and different organizations are filling the gaps where previously maybe another organization was doing some of this survivor-centered and specialized service response.
My name is Angelina Ajonye. I work as the Social Empowerment Program Officer. The recent training we attended on handling disclosures and safe referral was so good to us as the team. It helps us learn the difference between us, the non-GBV specialist, and the GBV specialist. And also it enabled the team to understand how to conduct safer referrals in the communities. Being frontliners, we are always approached in the community during our interventions where people disclose the cases. So as they disclose them, they need to be supported, they need to be referred. So the trend helps us a lot by guiding us how we can conduct the safe referrals in the society. And also secondly, it prepared us mentally. As we went through the psychological first aid, we are mentally prepared to receive any case and refer to the rightful place. Also, we went through the referral pathway. We know where we can refer the survivor from which point to where he or she can access services. So the training was so great to us as the team. And we're also preparing, conduct the training to the remaining team because we never conducted to all of them. So we are on the verge of preparing to make sure that all our frontliners are equipped with that knowledge on how to handle disclosures in our communities. Because I know we're always approached with such cases in the society, and we need to know how we can refer them to where they can get appropriate services for them. Thank you.
And so here too, just to add, again, you can see, and Katie had mentioned this earlier in talking about sort of the reasons and the need for this project. Here, what Angelina mentions is that it was really important during this training that what was re-emphasized is the line between what a non-specialist can do versus what a specialist can do. And our goal here is really, and we've tried to be as cognizant of this as possible, is not to overstep. We don't want to give frontline staff any additional work. Everybody's already overwhelmed, but the goal here is to really strengthen and empower non-GBV specialists to know what is within their gamut, what they can do. And again, really with the ultimate goal of just facilitating the survivor to kind of get into the referral pathway and get access to these specialized services. And also you can, as Angelina noted in the video, to really prepare the staff themselves, giving them tips on self-care, how to make sure that they themselves are in a good state emotionally to actually handle these disclosures. All right, so what are our next steps? So that was all feedback from just one of the pilot activities. We do have a wide range of other activities that will be taking place over the next couple of months. So all of the pilot activities are running over the span of a 12-month period. What we are hoping to do, of course, is at some point during the, at middle of the way through the pilots, reflecting on the pilots with program staff and key stakeholders through what we are calling our midpoint workshops. So ideally, the goal is to hold these sometime towards the end of this summer, August 2024. And after that, taking some findings that we've gotten from these midpoint workshops to either tune or, update the pilot programs, or if something's working to, start thinking about, okay, how do we want to write up these results? What do we want to see in terms of guidance documents that come out of these pilot activities? And all of this will culminate in that last green box at the bottom in this production of a final larger guidance note and discussion around building these pilot activities, what has really worked. And again, what we're hoping will be scalable and replicable in other contexts, in other emergency and humanitarian contexts. So this is, our kind of plans for the remainder of phase 2, which we're currently in, and then the last phase of the project, phase 3. So thank you all so much for tuning in and for listening. I saw we already have some questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to pass it back to my colleague Maureen, who will take over.
Thank you so much, Gabriella, and thank you all for listening and participating. Please do put any questions that you have in the chat. Gabriella will also be putting the links to all of our reports in the chat, so you guys can take a look at those. As well as, I did mention it in the Q&A, but I'll just say it here, we will send around the slides as well as the links, as well as the recording once it's available to anyone who registered. So all of that will happen after. So I do have a few questions before we get to some of the ones in the Q&A, but please add more if you have any. And my first is really first off to Katie, but then if anyone else has any input, please feel free. But Katie, how is this program different from what we already have in the GBV Pocket Guide, and why is it needed from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think there's a few reasons why we've found that this was needed. And firstly, it's because it's so the GBV Pocket Guide is meant for a context where there's no GBV services at all. And what we found is, although that's the case in a couple of the locations where we work, for example, in DRC, in others, we do have access to some GBV services. There is case management in some of the other locations, or there's, a mixture of services. It's not black and white. It's not all or nothing. It's always kind of something in the middle. And those services may be of varying quality. There may be access issues, but they may still be there. So we felt like we needed something that was a bit more adaptable to different contexts. We've also made our handling disclosures and safe referrals training with components that are specific for gender-focused organizations, because there's quite a big cohort of organizations like Women for Women that do a lot of active work with women and girls, and they have those relationships and therefore need a bit more knowledge and support to handle that, because they're already kind of doing a lot of work in this space. And also our training has a lot, it kind of built out from the GBV Pocket Guide to really go a bit more in depth. For example, really a big focus on role play, scenarios, things that were really practical, so that our trainers were kind of acting out those situations, those disclosure situations, and kind of then in that process figuring out how to handle them. And also extra topics were included, like data security, confidentiality, which we found to come out of the research as being really important. So yeah, that's probably a few reasons.
Thank you so much. Anyone else from the panel have anything else to say on that one? If not, we'll move to the next, and maybe I'll give this one to Anastasia. So what do you see? As we've mentioned, we're doing this pilot in multiple different settings. So what are you seeing as similar or different about the pilots that are emerging in these different contexts?
Thank you so much, Maureen, for that question. What we are seeing across is one context specific, like what Gabriella had talked about during the assessment. The contexts were very, very specific. But the very first thing that is very common across the three countries, DRC, Iraq, and South Sudan, is the disclosure, handling safe referrals, and understanding where a non-GBV specialist begins and ends in terms of meeting the immediate needs of the survivor. Then the second thing is when we look at the three contexts, based on the menu that was provided because of the assessment that was conducted, we see that there are some areas that are common, like raising awareness is across the three countries. But there are those specific countries like Iraq, they would want to go ahead and work on psychosocial support systems, and more especially using the GBV Pocket Guide, because in that context, evidence is that a lot of the women may not necessarily want to go and report or go for the referral per se. And so equipping the frontliners to be able to use the pocket guide becomes very, very key. When we look at a context like DRC, they have specific things which they are focused on: how to refer women with disability, working to support survivors in terms of transportation to get to the specialized locations where they can get the services. And so that one, we called it emergency funding, which in the other context was not really a big need per se. Yeah, and then looking at the communities, the South Sudan team and DRC felt that the community members, especially the religious leaders who have from time to time are able to receive cases of GBV, if they do not know how to respond, how to refer safely, and how to maintain confidentiality even as they handle these survivors, then becomes a big problem. And therefore, they focused on having this category being trained to understand how to handle disclosure, to understand what exactly it is when you get a case of gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. I think that's really helpful context to be thinking about our pilots. So I'm going to move to some of the questions that are coming in the chat because there's so many really good ones. And I'm going to stay with Anastasia for a moment and ask you the first one. So can you share more about how to build the capacity of GBV service providers? So, thinking perhaps about what we're doing in DRC, I think maybe is a great example of previously, I know what you guys have done and what you're doing currently, but you also might have other examples from your knowledge. You're muted.
How are we building the capacity of
the
staff
GBV
first?
service providers? Yes, the specialists.
Yeah, the service providers first. We had to do capacity mapping so that we understand what are the areas where they have knowledge and skills and where do they need more emphasis. And this is in relation to the health providers, the legal providers, and also the psychological, psychosocial support, and also the security. So mapping those partners to be able to bring them together and using the tools that we have been able to develop during the pilot, we are able then to take them through the training, and especially because we want to focus more on the survivor. So this project purely focuses on survivor and how, what we say, survivor-centered approach, so that we do no harm, they understand confidentiality, they understand safe handling, and also to make sure that the cases are managed and managed well. So in terms of the training, we get support from specialists who then come in and train the organizations that are providing case management, and those who also provide legal aid, those who provide psychosocial counseling, and how they do it. So in terms of the details, we identify trainers who are able to deliver the training, and we monitor how the trainings are being done. Yes, so that basically that is what we do for the specialists.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. And I think this is a really kind of key thing that the project is trying to explore, right? Just because, organizations like Women for Women don't provide response services specifically, doesn't mean that nothing can be done to strengthen the existing services. So just as Anastasia said, getting consultants in this project, we're doing trainings on gender attitudes, right? So this is something that Women for Women knows a lot about is gender transformation. And so this is a role that an organization with a gender focus can play. So it's trying to learn where the best places are that we can intervene. So thank you so much, Anastasia. I'll give you a break and I will pass it over to Gabriella. And my question from the chat for you is, how is the project planning to consider the issue of confidentiality?
Yeah, so this is actually a great question because it took us a while to figure out how we were going to do this, primarily because what emerged is this pretty serious gap. So actually, most people we spoke to during the formative research project really knew how important maintaining confidentiality was. Actually, to the point where people were really able, in some cases, to almost kind of tell us back word for word from really key international guidelines, like the Pocket Guide, why maintaining confidentiality was so important. However, we found, of course, when speaking to women and girls and other survivors, that the actual act of maintaining confidentiality was not there and was missing. So we really had to figure out what were the kind of practical steps we could take to make sure people were understanding that, okay, it's one thing to be able to say, right, that confidentiality is important, but it's another thing to actually put it into practice. And I want to go back to what Katie had said earlier about this training that we've already started as part of our pilot activity. And the role playing. And basically we found through our trainings that role playing actual scenarios about confidentiality. So here, just a very simple example, right? You might have one story, hypothetical story about a kind of complicated scenario wherein, say, one coworker kind of discloses to another coworker that they've received this disclosure, something along those lines. And then what we would do as part of the training is you would open it up to a discussion with the participants in the training and really talk through, okay, so where do we see the violations of confidentiality and why? Why is this so important to not do? What happens if this kind of break in confidentiality occurs? So really the way we've been sort of building the capacity around maintaining confidentiality is actually talking through some examples that are complicated and sticky, and that really do kind of happen pretty regularly, especially among the staff of organization, like frontline staff, who really, right, they are talking to each other because they're overwhelmed, and these are the cases that they're hearing, and they're, it's just an everyday dialogue. So we've been really trying to put it into practice that way. And as well, I think it's important to mention that in the first activity that we've done, which is again about building the capacity of frontline staff to respond to disclosures, what we've also built as an add-on is a module just for managers at these organizations. And within that module, we really have a lot of work focused on, okay, as a manager, how can I make sure that confidentiality is maintained by my staff? What are the kind of helpful tools that are available kind of at the global or local level to kind of conveying how important it is to not do that, right? To not talk about cases, to not disclose any identificatory information. Yeah, so really what we found is actually just putting it into practice. So not lecturing people in these trainings about why it's important, but actually giving really concrete examples and having them work through, okay, why is this bad? And why do we need to maintain confidentiality?
Thank you so much, Gabriella. Really helpful and really informative answer. So I'm going to go to Katie now, and I'm going to again pull another question from the chat. So can you tell us a little bit, after the disclosure of survivors, what are the specific measures taken to ensure their safety in the communities, families? How do you monitor it? What does Women for Women do?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. It's something we've been grappling with a lot as we've been going through the training over the last few months. But I think the key point is that actually we're not meant to monitor. So the key thing we've been telling our frontline staff is we're not GBV specialists. We should not be monitoring. We should not be following up with survivors, because that puts them more at risk. If we contact them in the wrong way and try and call them or something, and then, an abusive partner picks up that call, we could be putting them in so much more danger. So because we see women regularly through our training anyway, if they come back to us and want to talk again, then we will, of course, be there. But our focus is on referring them to those specialist services. The other small element we have included in our training is only if women are really struggling, and if they refuse a referral to another specialist service, we may talk through some very basic kind of safety preparedness steps with them, which will just be asking them about, what previous coping mechanisms they may have used, if they've got other people they can go and ask to support them, just helping them think through those things, but not taking that too far, because really that's what case managers or specialists are for.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie. And again, this is such an important point and something that really, has evolved over time. And that's part of this project. It is a learning project. So we are trying to figure out what are the best steps. So I think this is a great example of how things have moved over time and how we've adapted based on the realities of the situation, and making sure that, again, we keep the safety of the survivor at the center. And while we think, oh, following up, that would make them more safe, in reality, after talking to a lot of specialists and non-specialists and people on the ground, really that decision was, let's keep it to as a light touch as possible, given our role as non-specialists. So we only have a few more minutes, so I'm going to pass on maybe one final question, and I'll pass it back to Anastasia again for the final word. And this is, again, thinking more about internally and Women for Women staff. And so how are we working to ensure that the frontline staff, they have the emotional support that they need, like the self-care? Can you talk a little bit about any of the training or the support that we're trying to give them in any of the pilot sites?
Oh, that is a very, very good question. And I know Maureen and the team, we've been discussing that during the trainings. Part of the training that we are providing to the frontliners is a duty of care, how to look after themselves, how to also identify when one has really got it. Because when you are dealing with the instances of gender-based violence, you are likely to begin to start feeling it, sympathizing, empathizing, and you definitely need to weigh yourself and know, when is it appropriate for me to seek help? When is it appropriate for me to put it a stop, take some days off, go and do something that is very different, just to remove myself from the stressful situation? So there is a training that we've been, which is part of the training that we are providing to our staff. And we are within the organization also, we are emphasizing the fact that one can go to the manager and say they need safe support system, which we have. We have a line that the staff can actually reach out. But many times the staff don't want to reach out there. They would want to do other activities so that they feel better than going to talk to somebody. But that's part of the training for them, to ensure that they understand that you can only go this far, and after that you may not be able to produce the results that you are expected. And it's a mental health issue that each and every one of us must recognize, so that they can seek help as early as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think we're just coming to time, so we're going to end the question and answer session here. I really want to thank everyone who's participated. Your questions have been so wonderful, and just listening to our program. This is not the end. We'll be sharing more as the program continues to roll out, and our learnings as we go. And obviously, of course, when we have the final guidelines and materials, we'll make sure you also all get that. So thank you to everyone participating, and in particular, thanks to my fellow panelists here, Gabriella, Katie, and Anastasia. We wish you a great rest of your day. So thank you all.